We have already talked about a few important things, so I'm not going to repeat those things. But I'm giving you a minute to maybe just talk about all those points. We defined what is hermeneutics, and before that, we first of all we talked about the concept phenomenology. There, we had occasion to discuss the ideas of Husserl, that is German philosopher. Later, we saw that how one of his most celebrated disciples, Martin Heidegger, differed from him, and Heidegger advanced his own ideas. After discussing Heidegger's ideas, we had a look at two important names. One was American hermeneutist, that is E.D. Hirsch, and the other was another important name, Gadamer, who was a German philosopher, right? So German philosopher Gadamer and American hermeneutist E.D. Hirsch, we discussed their ideas. And you know that Hirsch was important because he was talking directly about literature and literary meaning. So many of those important questions like what is the meaning of a work, how do we interpret a work, whether the meaning of a work is stable for all times or whether the meaning changes, who are the people who receive a particular work, all these questions were discussed. And then we took these questions again when we defined the concept of hermeneutics. What exactly is hermeneutics? Because many words have come up again and again in this entire discussion. One is hermeneutics and one is phenomenology. So hermeneutics we define, and you know that many of these important names that we encountered in this discussion, they were using hermeneutics. Now, one very important offshoot of their development was one particular theory which developed in Germany. That theory has a name. It is called reception theory. Reception theory. We were just in the midst of some discussion about reception theory, but otherwise we have covered a lot of ground. And reception theory is the subject that I am discussing today. So I'm going to unmute you for a while so that for about 2 minutes you can possibly say something. And you know that when I unmute you, it becomes a bit chaotic also. So it is just for 2 minutes, but maybe we can hear something from you. So Afrin is here and you just raise your hands and others will know that you are saying something. So who will say something first? Just raise your hand. Yeah, Afrin is going to say something. Okay. So let Afrin be unmuted. Not all, but Afrin be, we'll just unmute Afrin for a while. This is Afrin. Yes, this is Afrin. Yeah. Just a minute. Yes. Yes, Afrin.
Sir, in the last discussion, in the last class, we have discussed phenomenology, and we have discussed somewhat about hermeneutics, and then we discussed about then we discussed something about German reception theory, and uh, uh, um we discussed some bit about University of Constance, and
Exactly. University of Constance.
and yes, sir.
Yeah, please go on. Go on. Please continue, Afrin.
Sir, we discussed that in German reception theory, human significance is very much important, and uh, uh, the we discussed something about historical positivist theory, historical positivist paradigms.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
Somebody just speak about hermeneutics. Maybe say something about hermeneutics. What exactly is hermeneutics, and how did we discuss hermeneutics? Yes. So raise your hand.
Sir,
Raise your hand if you want to talk about hermeneutics for about maybe just 2 minutes? Who? Anyone? It is the study of understanding. It is a study of interpretation, meaning, those things, right? And you know that it takes its name from Greek mythology, from one important god. He was Greek god Hermes. And what was the job that Greek god Hermes used to do, or what is he known as? Basically, he was the deliverer and interpreter of messages. So that means when you think about a message and this message is a kind of text, so we talk in terms of, say, interpreting that message. So hermeneutics is basically a study of understanding. It is basically a study of interpretation. So we know that it also has a particular history of the interpretation of biblical texts. So basically, it was applied to a study of the Bible, and of course, many of those biblical stories. And you know that scriptures need to be interpreted. Scriptures need to be interpreted at a later time also. So hermeneutics essentially was concerned with the study of scripture, basically meaning and interpretation and understanding of scriptures. But gradually, its scope widened, and you know that hermeneutics was also used to study different kinds of texts, not necessarily biblical texts. And that text can be written, that text can be performed, and that text can be photographic. So the images that you see, they come in the category of photography. The performance that you see, whether it is a performance on the stage or a performance on the screen, so that is also an aspect of text. And of course, all those stories, poems, novels, that means written text. So hermeneutics can be used to understand basically all three kinds of text. One very important name in hermeneutics is Friedrich Schleiermacher. Friedrich Schleiermacher. So you can possibly Google this name also. One very important thing about hermeneutics is that it is a study of a dialogue between past and present. It establishes a dialogue between past and present, a point that we have discussed. And it tries to remove all obstacles which can hinder interpretation. So we study a text and there are some obstacles in the interpretation of that text. Hermeneutics tries to remove all those obstacles. There is another term which is related to hermeneutics, that is hermeneutical circle. It means that there are threads in a work and there is a particular context. So different threads of a work or different say aspects of a work or different features of a work can be interpreted, or they are intelligible only with reference to the context, and context is intelligible with reference to all those features of a work, and that completes a kind of hermeneutical circle. So hermeneutical circle, if you see, context and different features together with the context complete the hermeneutical circle, and context together with all those different features complete hermeneutical circle. You see that there is one charge against hermeneutics, that it was really used to study not only scriptures but also important canonical works, important works in the history of literature. That means works basically written in the past. How will hermeneutics apply to current works? That is again a question open to debate. So just this bit of revision about hermeneutics. And of course, we have seen that Gadamer, we have already come across that how some ideas that you encountered while discussing hermeneutics, they are relevant to our study of Gadamer's ideas also. So finally, when we see this whole field of study, which goes by the name of reception aesthetics or reception theory, reception aesthetics and reception theory, you can show them this. Yeah, children, just 1 minute's digression. Sami ma'am is showing you something, and
Oyster
this
mushrooms.
is oyster mushroom. Just see, this is something
Exotic.
which is very exotic, and this is something which was grown at home.
This is slant curry, slant.
Okay. You can show it yourself and you can talk about this.
अरे ठीक है.
Come. Just 1 minute. Just 1 minute. Just 1 minute. Yeah. It
अरे,
won't hurt them.
break.
It won't hurt them. It won't hurt them.
Hello, good morning, all of you. Hello.
Just show it.
Can you see this?
Oyster mushroom.
These are oyster mushrooms,
Yes, ma'am.
and they are exotic and not available in Aligarh. Very rich in B vitamins. So super healthy food. Anti-infection, antiviral, and we're growing them at home. They grow in grass, and you know, what should I say? Wood shavings. They don't grow in soil. So this is fungus. This is not fruit or vegetable, and they're extremely beautiful. You know, like shaped like oyster shells. These are oyster mushrooms.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for this little digression. Yeah.
Thank you.
Some light movements won't hurt. Yeah. So we come back to reception theory. Okay, reception theory. And you know that which is the name which is associated with reception theory? One very important name. And this important name is the name of Robert Joss. That is Hans Robert Joss. H-A-N-S, Robert, and J-A-U-S-S. Who was Robert Joss? Again, a very important German theorist. Afrin mentioned that University of Constance is a very important center of reception studies. Now, there are some powerful influences on reception studies. That means if we study reception of works and if we study reception theory as a whole field of literary studies, we can also note some points of comparison between reception theory and some other theories with which you are familiar. You can say that there are some important precursors of reception theory. You can also say that there are some powerful influences on reception theory. So we identify 5 important influences on reception theory. 5 important influences on reception theory. And of course, this is the research of one very important writer. And this book is titled Reception Theory. It was published under one particular series, that is New Accent series, brought out by Routledge. So what are those 5 major influences on reception theory? One major influence is Russian formalism. Russian formalism, you have already come across this term and you are also studying Russian formalism. So very quickly, Russian formalism, as the name implies, talked about form of literature. But it talked about form as a matter of using some devices by writers. So for Russian formalism, art was understood in relation to the devices which writers use, because they were basically concerned with one very important question, and that question was, what is literary and what is literariness? And the search for literariness took them to study art and the devices which are used in a work of art. So art becomes a kind of device This was an important idea in Russian formalism. Another important idea in Russian formalism was that art makes things strange. It defamiliarizes our reality. So this concept of defamiliarization, that means something with which we are familiar, but we usually do not pause and see the nature of this reality. We simply recognize things which are around us. We don't see them. Recognizing something is a very passive kind of activity, but seeing something is a more active kind of activity. So if a writer writes about a tree, or if he writes a story about a leaf on a tree, we see those leaves every day, but we simply recognize those leaves. But the writer makes us see those leaves because he defamiliarizes the familiar. That is an important aspect of Russian formalism. Another important of Russian formalism was that it was also interested in the question of literary history. In literary history, there are some forms of literature which are considered important. Later, those forms become unimportant, and then new forms come up for discussion. So, a minor form which could have been popular maybe 200 years ago, that form is neglected, is not discussed, but maybe 200 years later, that form becomes important. So this entire development of literary history was also something which interested Russian formalists. So when we say that Russian formalism was one major influence on reception theory, we are saying that this conception of art as devices, this whole idea of defamiliarization, and this interest in literary history, all three important concepts had their influence on reception theory, right? There is another very powerful influence on reception theory, and this is one German philosopher whose name was Roman Ingarden, Roman, Roman, and Ingarden, Ingarden, Roman Ingarden. Roman Ingarden talked about text, and he talked about the fact that text do not always come ready-made with their meaning, but rather text have some gaps or some points of indeterminacy. This is an important word. Texts have some points of indeterminacy. When we say indeterminacy, let us try to know what we mean by indeterminacy. You have the word determine. You determine something. You determine the meaning of something. And its opposite can be, say, something which cannot be determined. Indeterminacy means those points which are a bit vague, where something is left out, where something is not said, and where the reader is expected to fill up the gap. So all texts have those points of indeterminacy. That is the idea of Roman Ingarden. There is another interesting word that Roman Ingarden uses. A text is basically a kind of schemata. Schemata means a kind of, say, skeleton structure. It gives you kind of framework, and then that framework is filled up by the imagination of the reader. So these two important things, indeterminacy, all texts, especially those literary texts, they come not ready-made with meaning, but rather they have points of indeterminacy. They are a kind of schemata which are, and there is interesting word, given a kind of concrete form by the reader. So texts achieve concretion. some kind of solidity. A schemata, a skeleton structure achieves some solidity by the act of reading on the part of a reader. So this is another important concept, and we'll come back to this when we take up Jaws. And then there was another powerful influence, and that was Prague structuralism. And you know that Prague structuralism developed, or it had a very large canvas. Structuralism developed in Russia, structuralism developed in Prague, and structuralism also developed in France. So Prague structuralism is also an important influence, especially the work of John Mukrovsky and Felix Bedica. Then there is another name we have already discussed, his work, Hans Georg Gadamer, and that is why we are discussing hermeneutics. His view of hermeneutics, which we have discussed, especially that dialogue between past and present, which was an important idea in his work. And he also had a very positive view of prejudice. When you read a work, you have some prejudices, you have some pre-understandings, you have some pre-ideas with which you begin that work. Now this prejudice is not a bad thing in Gadamer, but rather it's a positive thing. It's a creative prejudice. And why? Because this prejudice has come from literary history, from a long history of reading. It is part of a whole tradition of reading, a part of a whole literary tradition. So if you start reading a work and you have a certain prejudice which you bring to that work, but that prejudice is not a negative thing, but rather it has come from literary history, it has come from tradition, it has come from long association with works. So Gadamer is important for these ideas. First, his views on hermeneutics, especially this relationship between past and present, whenever we talk about works of literature, and also his positive view about prejudice. So Russian formalism, Roman and Garden, Prague structuralism, and ideas of Gadamer. And which is the fifth very important influence? That fifth important influence is sociology of literature. Sociology of literature. When I say sociology, don't think that my sheen kaf is not drust. The correct pronunciation is not sociology, but rather it is sociology, right? So what is important here is sociology of literature. Means literature exists in a particular time period, and there is also a history of taste. History of taste. What people liked at a particular point of time, what were their taste about things, how their taste changed, and similarly how something is received, how something was received earlier, how something was appreciated and not appreciated, and also this question of historiography. Historiography is different from history, that is method of studying history. Theory of, say, history writing, historiography. Just to make it more clear, you say that Marxist historiography is different from postmodern historiography. In Marxist historiography, what is important? Economic factor, class struggle, how different classes struggled for power, how economic considerations played a very important role in the development of different institutions. That is Marxist historiography. On the other hand, you also have terms like nationalist historiography, especially with reference to history of India. Nationalist historiography In other words, actually it means that history written from a particular point of view. And then British historiography was another term where British historians try to interpret Indian history in a particular manner. So historiography basically ideas about writing history. Now sociology of taste and reception of works and writing of history, these are all important questions in sociology of literature. So sociology of literature also became a very important influence on reception studies or reception theory. Now we can possibly talk about reception theory in greater details, and we can possibly see reception theory in a more clear light. So Robert Joss, he used one concept. That concept comes from one important scientist, T.S. Kuhn. What is that concept? The concept of paradigm. The concept of paradigm. And there is another term which he uses. That term is horizon of expectations. Horizon of expectations. Right. So what is important for Joss is literary history. He is greatly interested in history, and he is greatly interested in literary history. So you know that if Joss is interested in history, if he is interested in literary history, where is this influence coming from? Obviously, it is coming from sociology of literature. It is coming from, say, also Gadamer. But he is also interested in formalism. He's also interested in formalism. That means study of forms of literature, because literature, he was unhappy with the development of literary history in his time. Often literary history was written in a particular manner. And what was that manner? Some important political and economic events, some important events which were important from the point of view of politics, from the point of view of economics, they were described. And then the work of a writer was described. The idea was that there is a relationship of cause and effect between those developments in the field of economics, in the field of politics, and works of literature. That means there is a direct cause and effect relationship. So for example, if a particular work is written today, there is one particular cause. You said, you discussed, okay, say the scare of COVID virus, the scare of, say, coronavirus. And if a particular work is showing some kind of anxiety, you say that, okay, because there was anxiety about this whole thing, and so the writer's work also shows that element of anxiety, this cause and effect relationship. And similarly, if industrial revolution happened, then these works show the influence of industrial revolution. So usually literary history was also written in this manner, where a cause and effect relationship was seen between developments in the outside world and works of literature. Joss was not too convinced with this cause and effect relationship, right? So this is an important thing. But he was interested in formalism, and he was interested in Marxism. You see, usually Marxism and formalism are considered two contradictory movements, two contradictory impulses. And I am giving you an idea. Say, usually it is also said that if you are studying only the form, if you are studying syllables, sounds, structure, rhythm, all those things, and you are not taking up political questions which the work may imply, or some other questions the work may possibly have. Then probably you are running away from the real issues. This charge can be made. Okay, let us just look at it this way. Suppose there is a novel about exploitation of people at the hands of the political class. Suppose there is this novel, any novel, a novel which talks about the exploitation of people at the hands of the political class. This is a theme. And the novel uses very good language. Novel is divided into neat chapters. The novel also has very poetic kind of description of things. There are two critics. One is talking simply about the structure of sentences, the sounds which are used in a work, the patterns, the metaphors, the similes. Another critic is talking about the political class, that this political class has reduced these people to this kind of situation. This class is very cruel, this is very insensitive, and people must revolt against this class. Now, which of these interpretations is likely to land you into trouble at the hands of the political masters of the day? So, may I ask one of you, which interpretation? Okay, Arisha, I am, say, unmuting you. Arisha, can you hear me?
Sir,
I'm sorry. Yes, Arisha.
yes, sir.
Which interpretation? Which of these two interpretations is likely to land you into trouble? If you simply talk about, say, structure, rhythm, syntax, sound, intonation, or you talk about this political question and hold the political class responsible for that exploitation.
So I'm understanding a little bit only from.
Okay, maybe I mute you and I ask Ehsan, yes.
The second one, sir, the political one.
Obviously. And so this is one important criticism of formalism. Right, this is an important criticism of formalism. So usually formalism and Marxism, they were seen as two contradictory positions. Actually, there was one very interesting observation about formalism, and that observation was that too much focus on form and too much preoccupation with form will possibly not result in any revolution. Okay, so when Joss entered the scene, he found that Marxism and formalism, they were considered two contradictory positions. But he saw no dichotomy as such between the two positions. So one important thing that he did was, in his theory, he tried to bring the two positions together, right? So Marxism and formalism, they come together in his theory, in his reception theory. Now we have very little time, so if it just goes off, just bear with me, because after that we'll have say 10 minutes break. So Marxism and formalism, there is no dichotomy for Robert Joss. That was one important thing that he started with. And then he also believed that if literature is studied, it should be studied as a dialectical process of production and reception. That means both things are important. Production of literature, when something is produced, and its reception also. And this is true about many other things also. Say any text, its production and also its reception. Both things are important. So he talks about both these things. Now, if we see other things about his work, he offers a historical dimension, or he offers a historical dimension to reader-based criticism, right? As I said that he also made a very interesting analogy between a literary work and a timeless monument. He says that literary work does not show the same face to everyone in different periods. It is not like a monument, which or Mount Everest, which was seen 200 years ago by somebody and which is seen by people today. So meaning is not fixed that way. Two words which are important. One is paradigm, and when he used the word paradigm, he brought the word paradigm from one scientist. That means in different periods there are different paradigms, different store, a certain storehouse of ideas, a certain kind of framework, a certain way of seeing things, a certain way how we look at things. So 19th century looked at things differently, and 17th century looked at those things very differently. When we are at a particular point of time, we do not have the sufficient distance to see those things from a different perspective. When we are part of a particular time period, possibly we do not have that distance with which to see that thing. There was also the term horizon of expectations. Now this is an interesting word, horizon. Joss talks about horizon of expectations of a certain kinds of readers. So if we are readers, we have certain horizons of expectations. If there was a writer like Shakespeare, Shakespeare also had a certain horizon of expectations. I'll explain this term horizon of expectations in the session after this break, because it can just go off any moment. So Joss, you know that there are 5 major influences on reception theory of Joss. We discussed those 5 influences, and then we also discussed the fact that there are some keywords which Joss uses. One is horizon of expectations and one is paradigm. And we also saw that Joss did not see any contradiction between Marxism and formalism. Usually Marxism and formalism, they are considered two very different kind of theoretical positions. What is horizon of expectations? And you can possibly note this, that